Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 38. Ever feel like political discourse has devolved into a shouting match? It's not just you. There's a growing concern about nasty politics, with its insults, threats, and worse.
Claiming my time.
No, I'm not going to give you your time back. We can stop the clock. You all continue to, you look like a Smurf here just going around and all this stuff.
You want to run your mouth? We can be two consenting adults. We can finish it here.
Okay, that's fine. Perfect.
You want to do it now?
I'd love to do it right now.
Well, stand your butt up then.
You stand your butt up.
Oh, hold on. Oh, stop it.
Is that your solution every poll?
No, sit down. Sit down. Okay. You know, you're a United States Senator. Sit down.
Oh, okay.
Sit down, please.
This negativity not only pushes people away from political participation, but it also raises serious concerns about the health of our democracy. Today's political landscape is tainted with nasty politics, a toxic brew of negativity that goes way beyond heated arguments. We're talking insults aimed at politicians and voters alike, a toxic stew of conspiracy theories, occasional threats of violence, and in rare cases, actual violence. Civil discourse gets drowned out by the noise. Nasty politics can also erode trust in institutions and make it harder for us to find common ground on critical issues. But is this the new normal? Can we find a way to have strong disagreements without resorting to nastiness? That's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and joining us is an expert on political violence and political psychology who has extensively researched the impact of negativity in politics.
I'm an associate professor. My name is Thomas Zeitzoff. I'm here just outside of Washington, D.C., and I'm a professor in the School of Public Affairs. And I study political violence. I study political psychology. My main kind of area of focus is why do people fight? How do leaders get people to fight or create conflict? And what role does social media play in that? And most of my work has actually been outside the U.S. So I've done work in Ukraine, Georgia, Mexico, Israel, Palestine, a bunch of different places. And then now I've started to study a few things back here in the U.S. So yeah, delighted to be here.
Dr. Thomas Zeitzoff is the author of the insightful book, Nasty Politics, The Logic of Insults, Threats, and Incitement. His research sheds light on why politicians resort to nasty tactics and how these tactics affect voters. So stay tuned for an engaging exploration of nasty politics, where we'll unveil why politicians use these tactics and explore ways to navigate it. I don't remember exactly how this book crossed my radar, but when it did, I kind of knew right away that I had to kind of reach out to you and see if I can get you on the show. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Delighted to be here. Yeah.
So, one thing, people say they don't like nasty politics, and I get this. I do these like man on the street outrage interviews, and I hear that kind of thing too. But it turns out it's more complicated than that. So we'll dive into that a bit. But I kind of wanted to start off, if you could just kind of give us, kind of a rough definition of how we're using the term and for the purposes of the book and our conversation today.
Sure. So nasty politics is like a catch-all term that I use to capture anything from like the kind of lower, sort of more quotidian, daily sort of insults and smears that politicians level at each other, all the way up to, conspiracy theories, which have become quite common. But then also, like I term it, intimidating statements. So these are promises to investigate opponents, throw them in jail. And then the rarer but kind of more serious stuff, which is incitement, threats to violence, and then actual violence that sometimes breaks out between political opponents. And we're, so we're clear here, I'm not so much interested in threats when we're talking about nasty politics that people make against leaders of other countries or people in other countries. This is about domestic politics.
Mm-hmm. Kind of the in-country fighting.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting book, and it goes so many places. And what we find, I guess jumping into that conversation about it's a little more complicated than people say they don't like it. You talk about there's some personalities that seem to like it. People sometimes kind of equate it with they're backing me up. They've got my back when they use this kind of rhetoric. Some things like that. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of those kind of cases.
Yeah. So the way that I sort of think about it is when I started this project, so I hinted at, so most of my work has actually been outside the US. So it's been in places where, nasty rhetoric was kind of part and parcel of politics. So like when Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey threatens to rip the heads off like the coup, the folks who were responsible for, the attempted coup against him, right? That's like, a little different than at least what we thought was standard American politics. And sort of the conventional wisdom is that nasty politics is distasteful, right? But it's persuasive and it works. And so people may say they don't like it, but it moves them, right? And persuades them to come over to your side. And what I argue in the book, and sort of, what I was originally persuaded, like I was like, that's what's going to happen. Nasty politics is going to work. It's going to persuade people. But what I found kind of over and over again, and there's more research that's coming out that sort of suggests this, is that voters don't like it, but it grabs their attention. So like a car wreck, a bar brawl, like bad YouTube videos, it grabs our attention, right? Which can be important for some politicians. It also signals toughness. And so this is the kind of key sort of thing, like if you're getting a divorce, right, and everything is fine and dandy, and you can say, yes, I want the polite divorce attorney who's going to split the assets in half really nicely. But if it's really acrimonious, or you feel that your former spouse is threatening you or other things, you're like, I want to get the meanest, nastiest divorce attorney. And it's the same thing here, is that this can be used to signal toughness that can, voters generally won't like, but when they feel threatened, or they feel like they're in a time of threat or uncertainty, they may seek that out.
Well, and that kind of ties back into this affective polarization stuff, and some of the things I observed are, it's not a scientific thing, but just kind of anecdotally in the conversations that I have with folks, that we sort of don't like nasty politics until we're, like you say, kind of backed in a corner, and we feel like now we want to push back, or we feel like we haven't been heard, and nobody's saying what we want to say. And I get that sense, I think, in the current political climate, I get that a little bit more from the right. I think the same emotions exist on the left as well. But I think that the right feels more persecuted, for lack of a better term, or like there's all these left-leaning media, and there's only these other ones that sort of say what we want to see. There's all these other politicians that don't sort of get out there and yell for us, and there's this one guy, we can sort of name who that is, who does that a lot. And he's not really one guy anymore. This has now become much more common, but it does feel like there's a little bit, or it seems like when I see it, this idea that it is a lot of that somebody's got my back finally, and I but at the same time, I wanted to kind of circle back to talking about that other countries, and in this work you take data from some countries that don't have that kind of affective polarization that we have here, and their party loyalty is lower, which kind of brings into question maybe some of us talking about affective polarization all the time maybe have it wrong. So tell us a little bit, like, how the reasoning behind the countries you looked at, and kind of how that informs the analysis.
Yeah, so there's you brought up a lot of really interesting points there. I'll try to address some of them. So like the first one, I think, is the reason. So I look at three countries: the U.S., which is, as you said, is like a place where there's like strong partisan ID. I'm a Democrat, I vote for Democrats, or I'm a Republican, I vote for Republicans, and party ID is pretty stable. And then I got interested, both because it's kind of a fascinating country, and my grandfather was born there in Kiev, is Ukrainian politics. And if you look back in Ukrainian politics, like one of the really interesting things, there's a lot of interesting things about it, even before the rise of the comedian turned politician Volodymyr Zelensky, who's the current leader. One is that there were more fights in the Ukrainian parliament than I think it looks like there's these amazing pictures you can see from back in 2008, where there's like a melee. 2012 there were debates over the language laws, whether making Russian an official language, and there was like a full-on legislative riot. I mean, some of the parties even basically recruited people who were former judo boxers, other people, to sort of like fill out the tough guy line. But what's interesting, right, is that most of the parties in Ukraine are not built around like clear ideological agendas. That's changing somewhat with the war, but generally speaking, they were built on personalities. Like, it was the party of Yulia Tymoshenko's bloc, right? It was built around Viktor Yanukovych, their disgraced leader, and people would switch parties often. I mean, Volodymyr Zelensky created a party that was named after his show Servant to the People, which was about basically a joke, a satire about a history teacher who gets fed up with corruption and then runs for office. And he named it after his TV show, and he captured a vast majority of the votes, both in his presidential election and in the parliamentary election. So if Ukraine has, or had, before the war, just as much, if not more, nastiness than US politics, and did not have the same kind of party polarization or even affective polarization, because people would change parties all the time, it raises the question, maybe it's not the affective polarization story. And that's kind of what I argue. That doesn't mean that there wasn't polarization in Ukraine. And I think it's the same case here. And this is the point that I try to make, is that polarization can be an elite phenomenon, right? I think a lot of times we make the misnomer of thinking that polarization, that people are divided, ordinary Americans, in red states and blue states don't like each other, and there's some of that for sure, and that's sort of trickled down. But this is much more of an elite phenomenon, right? And that was the case in Ukraine, where there were these fierce divisions between blocs associated with Viktor Yanukovych, who was more pro-Russian, and Yulia Tymoshenko, who wasn't. And so I think that's like one of the key things I always tell my students when we talk about this stuff in class, is that most Americans, I'm here, I'm in DC, I'm at an American university, I'm teaching a class on political violence. I tell my students, you guys are some of the most like 4 standard deviations above the mean in how much you care about politics, right? There's a reason USA Today is not adding another political reporter, but adding a Taylor Swift reporter, right? It suggests that, most people care more about other things. And so, but the people who care about politics, right, that's an important subset. And those are the, kind of elites. And I'm happy to sort of get more into that as well.
Yeah, and you're kind of using the term elite, sort of the political science sort of way, right? It's sort of politicians and the people, sort of
party
around
chairs,
campaigns and things like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say it's not just like, rich people, like
right.
It's people who care and follow politics, or who like participate like at local county. Exactly. Right. This is not, not just people who run for office.
And the other country that you looked at here was Israel. So tell us a little bit about how does that help inform what we see when we study just the US?
So if we think of the US as like the one where people have this really solid party identification, and they really care about whether Republican, Democrats is like a really well-defined identity. In Ukraine, people are switching all the time across elections. Right. Israel's kind of the middle case, right? Because you have a defined kind of right, center, and left, and people are loyal, like the people like Benjamin Netanyahu's right, kind of right-wing party Likud, right? So, Benjamin Netanyahu, longest serving Israeli prime minister, he's been under corruption investigation for a while. And so there he has people that are loyal to him in the Likud party, but people also switch and new parties pop up. So it's not as fluid as Ukraine, and it's maybe not as kind of calcified as the US. It's somewhere kind of in the middle.
And you talk about how certain personalities seem to be more likely to support violence and nasty politics.
Yeah, I think it's true, right? I mean, so we can't deny that there's like, a spectrum of personality types, in the world. We've all encountered them. And I think, the kinds there are, and I think it's helpful to think of this as a continuum, right? So there are people who, most people are going to find it distasteful, but then there are people who are maybe like, it's not that bad. And then there are people who maybe even enjoy it. And that's like a small sliver of the population. And we know that these folks are, aggressive personality types. So these are the kinds of people that like, boxing, MMA, right? Maybe they enjoy watching bar fights, but this is, a small 5 to 10% of the population, the people who actually kind of enjoy this rhetoric. But it's also important because, at least in certain places, and unfortunately we've seen a little bit of this in the US, the kinds of people that maybe are engaged in sort of political hooliganism or other things maybe are the kinds of people that excuse this kind of rhetoric.
Right. Yeah, they historically, what did you find? What have you found in terms of, particularly on the U.S. side? Like we perceive that things have really changed, like, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years. Is that sort of consistent, or are we just kind of not? Maybe we have rose-colored glasses when we're looking at this.
I think the answer is kind of both, right? So historically, like in the U.S., we've had periods of violence. So I always love to talk about the legislative brawl of 1858 in Congress, where you had this Democrat Representative Lawrence Keat, who was pro-secession, pro-slavery, eventually pro-secessionist, and he got upset when Galusha Grow kind of stepped onto the Democratic side of the House, and he called Galusha Grow, who's a Republican from Pennsylvania, he called him a black Republican puppy, and Grow basically said back to Keat, no slave driver will crack his whip at me. And then the Democrat Lawrence Keat lunged at Grow's throat, and there was a kind of a more than a 45-minute brawl with 50 different House of Representatives like going at each other's throat, and it only ended when one of the members of the House, this guy Barksdale who's a Democrat from Mississippi, basically his wig fell off and people started laughing. So we've had periods like this, and Joanne Freeman talks a lot about that in her book Fields of Blood, but that was in the lead up to the Civil War. And I'm not suggesting that we're by any stretch of the imagination heading towards the Civil War, but I do think some of the rhetoric, like with Trump around Milley recently that we've seen, threatening violence and treason investigations and other things, that rhetoric has maybe been around. I mean, you can go back to McCarthy or other sort of politicians on the periphery. I think what's different, and particularly what's coming from the right now, is from their leader, right? Trump has changed the politics, and I document how he, part of that is his, nature is to, he's a creature of the New York City media. He craves attention, and he, was really smart in 2016 about saying things that would then his tweets or his, sayings would be would be sort of the news story, and they would suck up oxygen, and he would get all this unearned media. But I would say the thing that concerns myself and folks who maybe have been in places where democracy is not quite as solidified, at least as we tend to think here in the US, is that a lot of the threats and investigations and other things have been done in other countries, and that's not those countries. When you talk to people who've lived through those, it's not a fun place to be. And it was kind of a little bit of an irony, was like I was talking with some of my political scientist friends, and remember we were I was having dinner with a bunch of them, and some of them were like people who specialize in American politics, and when Trump was elected they said the institutions will hold, right? The institutions will hold, the institutions are there. And folks like myself and others who study comparative politics or places outside were like, I don't know, I've seen this movie before, and the institutions hold until they don't. And so I think that's probably like the most concerning sort of viewpoint about this sort of recent turn in rhetoric, is it's there's some of it that's ridiculous, but then some of it that's serious, right? I mean, I think more that we've found out about kind of what happened at January 6th, like there's a lot of focus on the insurrection that happened at the Capitol, but more that we find out about all the other things that were done, even if they were done in like a slapdash way. It was Trump was trying to hold on to office through irregular means. Political scientists call that an auto golpe or a self coup, and the media doesn't want to, not maybe doesn't want to, but is like hesitant to call it that. But and there's some political scientists who say you have to have the military for it to be considered a coup. But that's there was a legitimate debate in academic circles, and a lot of people like the Klein Center at the University of Illinois and other folks who I would say are experts on coup, like there's a big debate about whether or not you consider what happened was like a self coup. And I think that's a problem, right? And so I think there's both the over coverage of some of the more flamboyant statements, but then there's also a missing, some of the really big concerning things that, like that the, party leader who incited, planned, and, supported this, right, is now going to be the party leader and stands a very good chance of being reelected.
Right. In the book, nasty politics mostly applies to speech and rhetoric. But I would think I'm sort of thinking that nasty politics is actually starts to apply to actions too. I mean, an example might be, sort of what happened with Obama's Supreme Court nominee. Like that was kind of a thing that didn't happen before. And now that's kind of like, well, the Democrats probably would have said, no, we don't want to do something like that. That's not appropriate. Now that it happened to them, they'll be the first ones to do it next time.
Yeah, I mean, so I see like rhetoric and like, I mean, there's some action, particularly the violent action that comes with it, but I think they are definitely related, right? Is that what you're talking about is what, some folks call like political hardball, is where you play within the lines of politics, right? But it doesn't advance democracy. And in fact, it can reduce it, democracy. I mean, this was one of the, when political scientists say, most democracies don't die, at the barrel of a gun. They die, with legal means. I mean, this was, what happened in Hungary is through completely legal means. There is no real opposition parties that can, take out Viktor Orban in his ruling party. And, through some of the states, like, I mean, I think some of the malapportionment that we've seen in Wisconsin, where, it's pretty much impossible for Democrats to win control of the House, in Wisconsin, even though they control the governorship. They have, a lot of statewide offices. That's a problem, right? That's a big problem, because the definition of democracy that I always like is democracies are, places where parties lose elections, right? And if parties stop being able to lose elections, that's a problem, right? So democracy is essentially this compact that, I may win now, but I won't do anything crazy, both legally or extra legally, to maintain power, because I'll run again in 2-4 years, and I'll get him next time. And when you start breaking down that compact, and that's the concern that I think we've sort of seen, and it's happened on the right, and there's a lot of explanations for why that happened, but that's a really big concern when you sort of stop, because then it becomes like every election is, if we don't win ...
Right. Yeah. And I've heard that referred to as sort of the loser's burden, kind of like it was a fundamental aspect of America for a long time. And
the revolution of 1800, that's what it is.
Yeah, and you lose, and you say, like you say, well, I lost that one, and I'll have an election in a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the most important things that, some people would say it's even more important than, the Constitution or other things, is that we essentially established the peaceful transfer of power through democratic means from Adams to Jefferson. It's a big deal, huge deal.
Yeah. And that's, I could say when that falls apart, it's scary times. Mm-hmm. So let's wrap up with a couple things. One is, anything I missed that you really think you really want to, make sure that we bring out? And then the second, and then finally, sort of, where's your research going next?
Yeah. I mean, so there are a couple things. One is, I would say there are like two things that I get asked or people point out a lot. So one is the social media. So, is this just social media did it, right? Did social media, was it social media, in the living room with the candlestick, and democracy was the body? And I don't think so. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can say, about, Meta and, Twitter, now X, or other things, and that, maybe it has warped some of the incentives, but all of our studies suggest that, as you pointed out, is partisan cable news plays a much bigger role. It's much more influential, and the people who have polarized the fastest has been like older Americans, and they're the ones that watch the most MSNBC and Fox. So I think partisan cable news is way more important than social media. And then the second question, which I think is, one of the big important questions, is, at some point, Trump will no longer be the leader of the Republican Party. Either he'll get pushed out, he'll, age out, or for whatever reason. And the question that people ask is, does Trumpism die, with Trump? Does the, party return? And, the glass, it depends on what you think. I would say probably not. because like, and you hinted at this as well, is that there's essentially this sort of deep narrative that's taken root, I think, on the right, that liberal elites at universities are trying to control the country. They control everything, and they're trying to ruin the American way of life as people on the right see it. And that story both preceded Trump. He's amped that up, and it will continue after he leaves. And so like, that's the for people that are pro-democracy, I would say that's concerning, because there's definitely an anti-democratic strain in Trumpism, but there's also optimism, is that just as Trump pro-Trump elites took over the Republican Party, maybe people that are not super embraced to Trumpism, or maybe there's a more democratic form of Trumpism that takes hold, and that can change too. So those are like the two things that I think are kind of important. And then the last thing I'll say just is, I think for a lot of times there was like a very famous political scientist, Juan Linz, talked about presidential systems like we have in the US, where people vote for individuals, and we have presidential elections where we don't vote for parties, we vote for individuals. And he always said, and he talked about the cases in Latin America and in Africa of countries that kind of copied the US. And he said presidential systems, tend to be unstable, because when there's conflicts between the Supreme Court or Congress and the president, there's no easy way to resolve it. You can't just dissolve and have new elections. And so these systems tend to be unstable. And he would always say the US, the big exception. And so I think one of the things that I would want us to think about is the US is exceptional in a lot of ways. The wealthiest country, civil liberties that are amazing. And, I think this country does a lot of things really, really well, but also maybe our politics aren't as special, and maybe we aren't as exceptional in this case. After all, I think it's the last 10 years of US democracy has suggested.
Mm-hmm. So what's on the radar for research? What are you doing next?
So I'm working on a new book, and it's in a very different vein. It's on the radical environmental movement. And so I've been doing a ton of interviews with people who were formerly involved or some currently involved in the radical environmental movement. And it's kind of two questions. Back after 9/11, the number one domestic terror threat was considered the radical environmental and animal rights movement. They were, the FBI had them at the top of the list of domestic terrorists. And then it dropped off like a rock by the end of 2010. Like the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Fronts were really not that active. So the question is, what happened to them? And then especially the second part is, given the threat from climate change, what does the future of radical environmental actions look like? So
that sounds pretty interesting.
It's definitely been interesting. And so radical politics, but of a different sort is where I'm headed.
Yeah, well, that sounds like I'll definitely want to see if I get you back on the show to talk about that book when it gets closer.
I'd love to chat with you, David. This was great.
All right, Thomas, I really appreciate it. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Have a good one. This was great.
You too. Take care. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.